They told you Africans didn't cross the Atlantic till slavery, that the first time a black man touched the Americas, he was in chains. But what if I told you that's not just false? It's backwards. What if the first ships to kiss these coasts were African? See, the lie starts with timing. They made it seem like history began when Europe showed up. Like before Columbus, there was nothing but jungle and superstition. But dig deeper into stone, into sculpture, into the wind patterns themselves, and the receipts start whispering a different story. Before the word Maya ever meant calendar or pyramid, before Columbus ever got lost on his way to India, the Olmecs had already carved faces in stone. Massive, majestic, African. You've seen them. 12-foot heads, wide noses, full lips, strong jaws, carved from basalt, so hard, even modern tools would sweat. And when the first archaeologists found them, they froze, because those weren't the faces of Native America they were expecting. You can almost hear the panic in their reports. Negroid features. That's what they called it. They didn't say, maybe coincidence, they said negroid. But then, poof, the descriptions disappeared from textbooks. Suddenly, the Olmecs became Proto-Maya, their sculptures rebranded as stylized art, because admitting that Africans might have reached Mesoamerica first, that would flip the whole table. And here's the wild part. It's not just about looks. The science of it lines up too. Oceanographers have mapped the trade winds and currents. From West Africa, if you sail out near Senegal, those same winds that carried hurricanes to the Caribbean will carry a ship there in 3 weeks. No compass needed. Just follow the current. Columbus himself used that African route. You think he invented it? Nah. He copied it, and we got receipts older than him. The Egyptian Book of the Dead talks about the land across the water where Ra sleeps. Mayan maps before the 1300s show western coasts curving into unknown territory. Not labeled Europe, not Asia, but a land they called the mountains beyond the sea. Now ask yourself this, why does no one teach that? Why is it that every time Africans travel in history, it's by force, not by skill? They'll tell you about slave ships, but never trade ships. They'll glorify Vikings crossing the North Sea in wooden boats, but act like Africans couldn't build vessels that lasted millennia. The Kingdom of Mali had entire fleets. King Abubakar II supposedly left with 2,000 ships, chasing the sunset, and never came back. You think he vanished? Or maybe he arrived. Think about it. The Olmecs emerge right after that era. The carvings, the art, the sudden leap in astronomy and pyramid building, all that blooms like a spark caught flame. The timing fits like a glove. And if you've ever looked at an Olmec sculpture next to an ancient Egyptian one, the resemblance is undeniable. Same aesthetic, same respect for divine geometry, same cosmic worldview, the micro matching the macro. That's not coincidence. That's cultural continuity. But here's where it gets deep. This isn't just about boats or stones. This is about memory, because when you erase a people's ability to travel, you erase their power to connect. And that's how colonizers rewired the story. They turned the master navigators into cargo. Man, imagine teaching kids that the same people who built the pyramids might have also built the blueprints for Chichen Itza. Imagine knowing your ancestors didn't just survive the ocean, they mastered it. That's a different kind of pride. That's dangerous pride. And you know how the system reacts to dangerous pride. They bury it under controversy. They call it fringe. They label you pseudo for even asking questions. But the irony, the first people to call the Olmec heads African weren't even black scholars. They were European archaeologists in the 1800s who hadn't yet learned how to censor themselves. So the question becomes, when did the censorship start? Who decided to rewrite those museum plaques and remove those early reports? And why does every major ancient civilization suddenly lose its color when the story gets told in English? You ever notice that? Egypt gets paler every documentary. Jesus gets lighter every Easter. And somehow, the people who sailed the world's toughest oceans from the Nile to the Atlantic, suddenly forgot how to build a raft. Come on now. The truth is hiding in plain sight. The Olmecs left faces, the winds left maps, and the African legacy left fingerprints all over the Americas. But history books act like those prints don't match anyone in their lineup. Because if they did, it'd mean the world's first transatlantic travelers weren't white explorers, they were black teachers. And that's the part that scares them, because it means every discovery Columbus bragged about might have been a rediscovery. So let me ask you this: what if those colossal stone heads in Mexico aren't random idols, but monuments to the first African ambassadors to the Americas? What if the Olmecs weren't inspired by Africa, but were descendants of it? And if that's true, what else have they buried beneath the sand and called coincidence? Let's stop dancing around it. The Olmecs weren't a mystery, they were a cover-up. See, when archaeologists first unearthed those massive basalt heads in Veracruz in the 1800s, they didn't whisper maybe African, they said it outright. José Melgar y Serrano, the first to publish on them in 1869, wrote that he was astonished at the Ethiopic features. That's their word, Ethiopic, meaning black, meaning African. He didn't need to guess. The nose, the lips, the headwear, it was too familiar. But fast forward a century later, and the narrative flips. Suddenly, those features become stylistic exaggerations. The lips are symbolic, the nose is regional variation. They'll write 1,000 words to avoid saying one African. Now, ask yourself, what changed? The stones didn't. The evidence didn't. What changed was the comfort level of white academia with black greatness. Because in the late 1800s, Europeans were still gorging on the myth of the civilizing mission. They needed Africa to be primitive, so that colonization could feel like salvation. But the Olmec heads didn't fit that agenda. How could the people they called savages have crossed oceans and taught civilization before Europe even learned how to bathe? That's why the erasure wasn't an accident. It was strategy. The less you believe in your ancestors, the easier it is to be ruled. Now, here's the receipt stack most folks never see. In 1311, Mansa Musa's predecessor, King Abubakar II, abdicated his throne to chase a vision. The chroniclers say he sailed west to discover the limits of the Atlantic Ocean. Not one ship, not 10, 2,000. The first fleet went, and one ship returned, saying the others vanished into a great river in the sea, likely a current. So Abubakar built a second fleet, even bigger, and went himself. He never returned, but the timing lines up almost perfectly with the Olmec cultural bloom. And before you call it coincidence, understand, Africans were already known master sailors. The Phoenicians learned from Egyptians. The Moors built ships with Latin sails that Europe copied centuries later. West Africans built the tequila, plank-built vessels with rudders and double masts. They had ocean maps encoded in rhythm and memory, not paper. The proof is in the languages too. Shared root words between Mandinka and ancient Nahuatl for things like water, sun, and king. But the most damning evidence, art. Because art doesn't lie for politics. You can stand in front of La Venta Monument 4, the Olmec head with the braided crown, and compare it to Benin bronzes. Same facial ratio, same headgear design, same sense of regality. There's no influence, there's identity. And then you've got the jaguar cult, half-human, half-beast figures across Olmec art, mirrored in the Egyptian Sphinx, mirrored again in West African iconography of divine power. Across continents, across oceans, same archetype. You telling me all these people just happen to imagine the same gods, the same faces, the same stories? Nah, somebody brought it, somebody taught it. The ships they used weren't myths either. In the 1970s, historian Ivan van Sertima put this in black and white in They Came. Before Columbus, he wasn't guessing, he showed photographs, ocean wind maps, and botanical evidence. African plants like the bottle gourd and cotton species existing in the Americas before Columbus. Genetic testing later confirmed it. West African cotton predated European contact. And yet Van Sertima was blackballed, his credentials smeared. Why? Because he dared connect Africa to brilliance. Now, let's be real. This isn't just about the past, it's about control. If Africans were already in the Americas before Europeans, it dismantles the entire foundation of colonial pride, because discovery becomes theft, civilization becomes plagiarism, and every statue, flag, and textbook celebrating European arrival crumbles under the weight of truth. That's why they buried it. That's why they called it pseudo-history. Because if people of African descent understood their ancestors didn't just endure history, they made it, the psychological chains would snap overnight. Think about the power in that. If a black kid in Louisiana or Jamaica grew up knowing that his people sailed the same ocean that brought them here, but on their own terms, you couldn't tell him he's lesser. You couldn't sell him inferiority. They don't fear our anger, they fear our memory. And that's the pattern. Every time a piece of evidence threatens the lie, they rename it. Negroid becomes stylized, Moorish becomes Mediterranean, African becomes Semitic. They change the label, keep the object, and pretend the contradiction doesn't exist. Museums do it daily. Unknown culture, unclassified origin. That's code for too black to explain. Even the trade winds themselves tell the story. There's a route from West Africa that sweeps straight into the Caribbean, another that hooks into Brazil. Those same currents carried Columbus in 1492, but who taught him the route? He studied under Moorish navigators who'd mapped those waters generations before. Even his logs admit seeing black men trading in canoes near the Cape Verde Islands before crossing. History didn't erase the truth, it edited. And here's the most sinister part. The erasure wasn't passive, it was weaponized. By controlling the image of the African, they controlled how the world saw genius, leadership, and civilization itself. They didn't just steal resources, they stole context. But once you start digging through the old journals, before history got sanitized, the truth breathes again. The Smithsonian archives, early Spanish letters, Arab chroniclers like Al-Umari, they all mention dark-skinned travelers, merchants, even colonies across the Western Sea. The lie only works when people stop reading. So here's the real question. If the world's oldest art, science, and ships all point back to Africa, what else have they scrubbed from the record? Because if the ancestors could cross oceans thousands of years ago, what does that make the version of history we've been taught? A story, or a cover-up? Let's start with what's missing, not what's left. Because that's how you find the truth in history, by noticing the holes they covered with neat explanations. When we talk about the Olmecs, the oldest civilization in the Americas, we're supposed to believe they appeared out of nowhere. A whole people with architecture, mathematics, astronomy, city planning, just poof, fully developed. No origin, no slow evolution, no migration trail. That's not how civilizations work. That's how cover stories work. Now, if you trace the oldest Olmec settlements, San Lorenzo, La Venta, Tres Zapotes, you find something strange. The first thing they build isn't a temple or a fort. It's a system of waterworks, underground aqueducts, stone drains that control floods and irrigate crops, hydraulic engineering at a level Europe wouldn't see for another 2,000 years. Where'd they learn that? Because across the Atlantic, in Mali and Egypt, water engineering was science, not superstition. The Niger's floodplain was a living textbook. The Egyptians built shadoufs and canals that mirrored the Olmec systems almost perfectly, down to the slope ratios. So either the Olmecs invented the same technology in total isolation, or they were students of teachers who'd already mastered it. And the deeper you dig, the more those teachers start to look African. Let's talk faces. The basalt heads were just the beginning. There are jade figurines, dark green with wide noses, coiled braids and thick lips. There's pottery found in Chiapas, with identical scarification patterns to those still practiced by Mandinka and Wolof, peoples of West Africa. These aren't random similarities. They're fingerprints. But you won't find these in high school textbooks. They live in storage rooms, and special collections of museums where the public doesn't look, because displaying them opens questions that rewrite hemispheres and language. That's the silent witness. Dr. Clyde Winters, another black scholar they tried to bury, studied Mandi inscriptions found on Olmec artifacts. He translated them using ancient African scripts, specifically the Vai and Libico-Berber alphabets. The words spoke of kings, gods, and voyages across the western waters. The Mesoamerican Museum curators said coincidence. But coincidence doesn't write in sentences. Even DNA can't hide forever. A few studies quietly surfaced in the early 2000s, hinting at traces of African genetic markers in pre-Columbian remains from South America and the Caribbean. Then gone. Funding pulled, samples lost, studies revised. Funny how the data disappears when it threatens a narrative built on white discovery. The same silence echoes in the libraries. During colonization, Spanish friars burned thousands of codices, books that held the Mayan and Olmec histories. They said it was to save souls. But you can't save what you destroy. You can only control it. The fragments that survived described visitors from the East with dark skin and woolly hair who brought knowledge of writing and measurement. You'll never hear that in a museum audio guide, because the goal was never to preserve truth, it was to curate power. Remember, this was the same church that declared blackness a curse while worshipping saints carved with brown faces. The same empire that painted angels white while enslaving the descendants of the real ones. You can't maintain that contradiction unless you erase everything that exposes it. Even the Olmec calendar, that complex 260-day system everyone calls Mayan, carries African fingerprints. It matches the agricultural cycles of the Niger River more than Mesoamerican rainfall. The 52-year round matches Dogon ceremonial cycles tied to the Sirius star. The same Sirius star that ancient Egypt aligned their temples to. You think that's random? That's inheritance. But the real kicker is navigation. The Olmecs didn't just appear, they arrived. Carved scenes on their artifacts show boats, not canoes, but ships with high prows and sails. When archaeologists first found these, they called them symbolic, because if they admitted those were boats, they'd have to admit someone sailed, and we know who was sailing. The same Moors who mapped the Mediterranean, the same Egyptians who reached Punt, the same Malian explorers who followed the trade winds that blow west every summer, the same winds Columbus later rode east. Those winds were the bridge between worlds, and the bridge was built by Africans. When you piece together the fragments, the heads, the inscriptions, the calendars, the water systems, the ships, a clear pattern forms, but white academia treats each piece like an isolated puzzle that just happens to resemble Africa. Because if they let the pieces connect, the lie collapses. That's why so many of these discoveries got buried under academic jargon. They'll say transoceanic diffusion hypothesis, not Africans sailed here. They'll say shared iconography, not same culture. They'll write a 300-page thesis to avoid one word, Africa. And don't miss the psychology of it. Because this isn't just about controlling the past, it's about shaping how black people see themselves now. If you think your ancestors were always enslaved, you behave like descendants of slaves. But if you know they were architects, navigators, and teachers of nations, you act like heirs of power. That's the real missing piece. The piece they can't quantify. The self-belief that comes when you realize you were never the student, you were the source. So when they say, there's no evidence Africans reached America, understand what they're really saying. We don't want to look, because the evidence is in their own museums, their own archives, their own language roots, their own ocean maps. They know, they've always known. But knowledge in the wrong hands threatens control. And that brings us to the next revelation, because this wasn't just about hiding evidence. There was a deliberate effort to rewrite what first even means, to make civilization sound European, and influence sound accidental. So the next question we have to ask is simple. When the world started calling Africa primitive, who stood to profit from that lie? Let's stop pretending this was an accident. History didn't just forget Africa's fingerprints on the Americas. Somebody scrubbed them out, and not because they doubted the evidence. They erased it because it threatened ownership. See, if you admit Africans reached the Americas before Columbus, you shatter Europe's favorite illusion, that they were the discoverers. The New World wasn't new, it was known, and if it was already known, there's no discovery, no divine right, no excuse to steal land, enslave people, and call it progress. That's the root of it, profit, the rebranding of exploration into empire. After Columbus returned, Spain built an entire theology to justify conquest. They called it the doctrine of discovery. It claimed that Christian nations had the right to seize any non-Christian land. But that doctrine only worked if no civilized people had been there before, and civilized in their code meant European or white. So when evidence surfaced that dark-skinned Africans had crossed the Atlantic centuries earlier, bringing art, science, and technology, that wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. It invalidated the empire's moral license. Because you can't claim to have discovered something when the people you enslave built it first. The first suppression started right there. Priests, conquistadors, and scientists worked together like a machine, burning codices, rewriting creation stories, and silencing indigenous voices that remembered the visitors from the east with black skin. When the Maya told Spanish friars that their gods came across the ocean, the friars wrote it down, then edited the across the ocean part out. Later came the museums. When European explorers started collecting artifacts from Mexico and South America in the 1700s and 1800s, they found thousands of sculptures, masks, and ceramics with African features. Instead of cataloging them as African influence, they labeled them local variations or stylized deformation. Translation: we can't admit what we see. The whitewashing wasn't just physical, it was institutional. Universities rewrote the timelines. They moved Egyptian pyramids forward in time, pushed Olmec culture backward, and made sure the two never overlapped. They changed the maps, altered translations, and built a wall between Africa and the Americas that the ocean itself couldn't match. Why? Because the moment you link those two continents, the whole Eurocentric narrative collapses. Europe's dominance depended on being the center of civilization, the point from which light spread to the dark parts of the world. But if Africa had been spreading that light first, then Europe's story becomes the copy, not the original. And power can't survive as a copy. Follow the money, and it's clear. The Atlantic slave trade needed a myth. You can't enslave millions of people and sleep at night unless you convince yourself they were savages. That myth of African inferiority didn't come from observation, it came from necessity. It justified the ships, the sugar, the cotton, the gold. It turned human beings into cargo by first turning history into propaganda. Every lie was a transaction. The whiter the history, the higher the profit. That's why the timing lines up so perfectly. The erasure of African presence in the Americas happened right as the slave trade exploded. They couldn't afford to show black brilliance. The same Europe that was draining Africa of its people was also draining its legacy. They didn't just steal bodies, they stole memory. Even language was rebranded. Moors became Arabs, Ethiopians became tribes, Africans became slaves. They took civilizations and renamed them until you couldn't trace anything back to greatness. And the Americas were their clean slate, the perfect place to plant a new story. So when history books talk about civilizing the New World, understand that's a cover-up in plain sight. What they really mean is erase the old world that was already there. It's no coincidence that by the time European cartographers started redrawing the world, Africa had shrunk. Look at old maps. The Mercator projection makes Europe look huge and Africa small. That wasn't geometry, that was psychology. A small Africa is easier to dominate. A big Africa makes the world nervous. You ever wonder why every Hollywood movie about ancient wisdom skips the African chapter? Why aliens build pyramids before Africans do? That's not ignorance. That's the continuation of the same campaign. Keep the source hidden. Keep the control. The system doesn't need you to believe the lie anymore. It just needs you to forget to question it. Because when you forget, the lie keeps running itself. That's how power sustains. Not by force, by memory loss. But truth has a habit of leaking through cracks. That's why the Olmec heads still exist. They couldn't burn stone. That's why West African oral traditions still talk about the Western Voyages. That's why Dogon astronomers still map stars invisible to the naked eye. Because the memory of movement never fully died. And that's what terrifies those who rewrote history. The idea that one day, the descendants of the erased will remember what they were before the chains. Because once that happens, the power structure crumbles. You can't enslave someone who knows they come from navigators and kings. So when we ask who changed the story, it's not just historians or colonizers. It's an entire system built on the economics of amnesia. Power feeds on selective history, and yet, the irony runs deep. Because the same winds that carried those African ships across the Atlantic still blow today. The same stars that guided their navigation still light the night. The same truth still waits beneath the sand, the ocean, and the textbooks. It was never destroyed, only disguised. So now the real question is, if they changed the story for power and profit, what would happen if the truth ever went mainstream again? Before Columbus ever discovered anything, the Atlantic Ocean had already been whispering to Africa. Those waves carried memories of sails made from woven reeds, of captains who followed the stars long before the compass. See, they teach you that Africa was isolated, stuck, waiting for discovery. But the truth? Africa was the world's original navigator, and the Atlantic was never a wall, it was a highway. Let's start with the most haunting clue. The Olmec heads of Mexico. Giant basalt faces, 10 feet tall, carved between 1200 and 400 BCE. Wide noses, full lips. African features so unmistakable that even European archaeologists had to use the word negroid when they first described them. Before that word became politically inconvenient, they later backtracked, of course, called it coincidence, said the features were stylized. But stylized after who? You ever wonder why the Olmecs, a civilization with no known connection to Africa, suddenly appear with advanced city planning, pyramid building, and an art style that mirrors Nile Valley precision? It's because the Olmecs didn't emerge from nowhere. They inherited a spark that blew in from across the sea. Let's talk currents. The kind you don't see on classroom maps. There's a natural river in the ocean called the Canary Current. It flows west, from West Africa, straight into the Caribbean. From the Gulf of Guinea, the wind and water move together, carrying anything that floats, canoes, ships, even rafts, directly to the Americas. Scientists know this, sailors have tested it. A small African fishing boat can reach Brazil in under a month, without modern navigation. So imagine what ancient mariners could do with intent, skill, and celestial maps. And Africans had all three. The Mali Empire alone had maritime records that would shock you. There's a story, not a myth, a record, written by Arab scholars like Al-Umari. He documented a conversation with Mansa Musa, the richest man who ever lived. Musa told him his predecessor, Mansa Abubakari II, wasn't content to rule an empire. He wanted to explore the sea beyond, so he built ships, 2,000 of them, and launched an expedition west across the Atlantic in the early 1300s. Only one ship returned, its captain terrified, claiming the others vanished into the horizon. Abubakari didn't hesitate. He handed the throne to Musa and set sail himself, leading the second expedition personally. and you never heard about it in school. Because if you accept that story, you destroy the Columbus myth. You erase Europe's first. You prove Africa didn't need saving. It was already sailing. But the evidence didn't drown with Abubakari. When Columbus finally arrived in the Americas, he wrote something strange in his journals. He said the natives told him about black men who came from the south and east, bringing spears tipped with a metal they called guanin. When Spanish scientists tested guanin, they found it was a West African alloy, 56% gold, 18% silver, 6% copper, identical to the metal used in Ghana. You think that's a coincidence? There's more. In Mexico, researchers have found African cotton, Gossypium herbaceum, dated before Columbus. It's not native to the Americas. It crossed the Atlantic. Same with bottle gourds used as containers. Same with linguistic traces that link Mande words to Mayan terms. And those Olmec sculptures, some wear helmets identical to the protective skull caps worn by ancient Nubian and West African warriors. What's more, the architecture lines up. The stepped pyramids of Central America resemble the terraced ziggurats of Nubia and Sudan. The mathematical ratio used in Mayan temple construction, the golden ratio, appears first in Egyptian temples. The Olmecs even used a hieroglyphic calendar that aligns with African cosmology, tracking the Sirius star system, the same star worshipped by the Dogon people of Mali for thousands of years. Ask yourself, how can two civilizations an ocean apart build temples, track the same stars, and carve gods with the same features, without contact? They didn't guess, they remembered. Even the materials tell on them. Ancient paintings in Mexico show figures with dark brown skin, wearing clothes woven in African patterns. Artifacts found in Central and South America contain traces of African plants, kola nut, yam, and even palm oil residue. Long before transatlantic slavery, that's not trade by accident, that's exchange by design. But here's where it gets deeper. Many indigenous American legends speak of the people of the East, dark-skinned visitors who came across the ocean, teaching them about farming, astronomy, and building. The Mayans called them Itzam, the bringers of knowledge. The Aztecs called them Tlapalan, the people from the land of red and black, and the Olmecs simply carved them in stone, immortal faces staring toward the sunrise, as if watching for ships to return. And yet, every time modern historians touch this story, they get nervous. They start saying words like speculative or controversial. But the only controversy is that it credits Africa with something great. Because if the world admits Africans crossed the Atlantic before Columbus, it destroys the foundational lie of Western history, that Europe brought civilization to the Americas. It didn't. It interrupted it. The truth is, the first transatlantic relationship wasn't slavery. It was scholarship, trade, cultural exchange, and it began centuries before Europe knew how to survive its own winters. So when you see those giant Olmec heads staring out from the jungles of Veracruz, don't see mystery, see memory. Memory carved in basalt. Proof that Africa's reach wasn't limited by the Sahara or the sea. Because Africa was never lost, it was everywhere. But if Africa's ships reached the Americas before Columbus, what about their ideas? If African ships crossed the Atlantic, then the question ain't if they reached the Americas. The real question is, what did they leave behind? Because trade leaves trails, ideas leave fingerprints, and when you study the Mayan world, their gods, their math, their architecture, those fingerprints look a whole lot like Africa's. Let's start with something simple. The Mayans had a calendar so precise, NASA still studies it. They measured solar years, lunar cycles, planetary movements, all without telescopes. Their zero appeared before Europe even had algebra. That's a big deal. But here's the kicker. Their calendar system mirrors the ancient Egyptian one, both built around the Sirius star, both tracking cosmic cycles with spiritual importance. Now, the Dogon people of Mali, thousands of miles from the Yucatan, also worshipped Sirius. They knew it was a twin star system long before any modern telescope could see it. They even had oral traditions describing its orbit and density, which matches what we now know scientifically. How'd they know that? By watching the skies for thousands of years, the same way the Mayans did. That's not coincidence, that's continuity. When you connect those dots, you start seeing the pattern. Both cultures built pyramids, aligned to the stars, both tracked Venus and Sirius, both wrapped their spirituality in astronomy, both even used the symbol of the serpent. In Africa, the rainbow serpent of creation. In the Americas, the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl, the bringer of light and learning. Different continents, same divine message. And this is where it gets wild. The Mayans described Quetzalcoatl as a dark-skinned bearded teacher who came from across the sea, promising to return. The Olmecs carved him in stone. The Aztecs built temples for him. And when the Spanish showed up, they were mistaken for his return. Now, who does that sound like? A myth? Or the memory of an African navigator? Someone like Abubakari's men, who sailed west and shared their knowledge centuries before Columbus. Let's dig into their knowledge. The Mayans used a base 20 numbering system. That same system appears in parts of West Africa, among the Yoruba, among the Mende, long before it shows up in Mesoamerica. Both regions even counted using head, fingers and toes, a full human-based math system. And the concept of zero, which Europe took credit for centuries later, shows up in both African and Mayan carvings, almost identically, a shell-like symbol representing completion and renewal. Coincidence or contact? Look at their cities. Mayan engineers used corbelled arches and geometrically perfect plazas. West African builders did too, from the stone cities of the Niger Bend to the Great Mosque of Djenné. The design logic was the same, build with the cosmos in mind. The temples of both cultures aren't random, they form constellations on the ground. If you map the layout of Teotihuacan, it aligns with Orion's belt, the same alignment used in Egypt's Giza pyramids. Same math, same sky, different continent. Now, here's where it gets even deeper, the gods themselves. In both Africa and Mesoamerica, the sun and serpent are divine teachers. In Egypt, Ra traveled the underworld each night, reborn with the dawn. In Mayan belief, Kukulkan did the same, descending beneath the earth and rising with the sun. And the ceremonies, both used drums, incense, rhythmic chants, and even mask traditions that symbolize divine embodiment. Even the faces of those gods, in the oldest carvings, have wide noses, full lips, and braided hair patterns, found across West and Central Africa. The earliest representations of the sun teachers in Mayan art look like African nobles, and that's not an internet theory, it's in museum archives. They call it stylistic ambiguity. I call it historical amnesia. Let's move to writing. The Mayans' hieroglyphic script, their system of logograms and syllables, visually resembles the Proto-Saharan script found in prehistoric West Africa. Scholars like Cheikh Enta Diop pointed out that even the symbols share similar structure, a mix of sound and meaning, image and phonetic clue. And when you compare both side by side, the DNA of communication is there, not identical, but related. But of course, mainstream archaeology doesn't want that conversation, because if the Mayans' intellectual foundation traces back to Africa, then so does a massive chunk of New World civilization, and that breaks the story of Western discovery wide open. You ever notice how quick they are to call something a coincidence when Africa's involved? But if it's Greece or Rome, they call it influence. When the Greeks studied in Egypt, it's called enlightenment. When Africans might have taught the Mayans, suddenly it's pseudo-history. Funny how that works. The truth is, Africans were the original professors of civilization. They didn't need a globe to map the world, they used the heavens. They didn't just build cities, they aligned them with eternity. And when they crossed the Atlantic, they didn't come to conquer, they came to connect. There's one more detail they don't talk about: language. Linguists have found African root words in several indigenous tongues across the Caribbean and Central America. Words for water, sky, and spirit that trace back to Mande or Wolof sounds.
The rhythm of the languages even matches, percussive, tonal, call and response. That's not a fluke, that's cultural fusion. When Africa met the Americas, something divine sparked, science merged with spirit, art merged with astronomy. The Olmecs became the seed of the Mayans, and the Mayans, they carried that torch forward, a light that would echo all the way to the Aztecs. But if Africa taught the world so much, why did the world pretend not to remember?
Every empire that steals knows one rule. If you can't own the truth, bury it. When Europe realized Africa had touched the Americas first, they didn't debate it, they deleted it. Quietly, systematically, like history's version of wiping fingerprints off a crime scene. Let's start right where the cover-up began. The Age of Exploration. Columbus comes back from his 1492 voyage, not just with gold and glory, but rumors. The Taino people he met told him about earlier visitors, black men with spears, tipped in gold. That line alone could have rewritten everything, but instead, it got buried under royal propaganda. Because Spain and Portugal weren't just exploring, they were building narratives. See, the entire Age of Discovery was a branding campaign. Europe was desperate to justify its violence. If they admitted Africa had already been here, that would have meant the New World wasn't new, that their conquest wasn't discovery, it was trespass. And that's the last thing a thief wants you to realize, that what they're bragging about stealing was never theirs to find. So they rewrote it. They scrubbed maps, altered journals, burned indigenous records. They redrew coastlines to remove African trade routes. Even the color of the story changed. Look at the early paintings of the Olmec heads, or the Mayan nobles that archaeologists first uncovered in the 1800s. Most of those sculptures were documented with clear African features, but by the early 20th century, artists began restoring them, shaving down noses, narrowing lips, bleaching the pigments used to color the stone. They called it preservation. What they were preserving was white comfort. Europe learned early that control of the image means control of the mind. If Africa built something, rename it. If Africa discovered something, redefine it. If Africa reached somewhere first, deny it. It's the oldest colonial game in the book. Power through narrative. Let's rewind even further, to the scholars who made sure the lie stuck. When Spanish and Portuguese monks translated indigenous codices, they edited or destroyed sections that mentioned dark-skinned teachers or visitors from the East. The Codex Vaticanus, the Codex Chimalpopoca, and the Popol Vuh, the few that survived, all reference gods or leaders arriving from the sunrise in ships. But European translators dismissed those as symbolic. You ever notice how Africa's achievements only become symbolic once someone else wants the credit? Then came the 1800s, when archaeology got racialized. European museums decided what ancient faces should look like. Negroid features became taboo in academic papers. When scientists found skulls in Mexico and Peru, with cranial shapes matching West African types, they buried the findings in private archives. Others reclassified them as primitive variations, because to acknowledge Africa meant to dismantle the myth that Europe birthed civilization. And make no mistake, it was a myth by design. After the transatlantic slave trade, Europe needed moral justification. How do you enslave people from the very continent that taught the world math, medicine, navigation, and architecture? Simple. You rewrite their story to make them look like late arrivals to history, not pioneers. You cut them off from their ancient genius. You make them forget. That's why every African triumph got recast as an accident. Every ancient ship became a drift voyage. Every sculpture with African features became stylized. Every shared symbol became coincidence. And by the time the 20th century rolled in, textbooks had locked the lie in. Columbus was a hero, not a hijacker. Africa was the dark continent, not the original light. And indigenous Americans were discovered, not remembered. But here's where the psychology gets darker. Europe didn't just erase evidence, they replaced it with illusions. They filled museums with fake histories, painted angels white, recast Egyptian gods as Mediterranean. and rebranded stolen artifacts as universal heritage. It's not just historical theft, it's identity laundering. Ask yourself, why does the average person know Columbus, but not Abubakari? Why do we celebrate Viking explorers who reached North America centuries later, but never mention African navigators who sailed before them? Because if you admit the truth, you dismantle the entire architecture of Western superiority. You destroy the myth of Europe as the bringer of progress. You remind the world that Africa was teaching when Europe was still crawling. That's the real fear, because once you restore Africa to the center of global history, everything changes. Suddenly, discovery looks like theft. Exploration looks like invasion. Civilization looks like recolonization. And Europe's biggest export, its narrative of greatness, collapses under its own hypocrisy. Let's be real. You can't claim to be the first to cross the ocean if there's already a footprint on the shore. And those Olmec heads, those are footprints in stone. But erasure has limits. Stone speaks. DNA remembers. Ocean currents don't care about politics. And truth, no matter how deep you bury it, doesn't drown. The evidence keeps resurfacing. The metal alloys, the art, the linguistics, the agricultural links, they're all whispering the same thing. Africa was here. And the deeper we dig, the louder that whisper gets. Because if Africa taught the Mayans, traded with the Olmecs, and navigated the Atlantic before Europe ever built a compass, then what else have we been lied to about? No matter how many libraries they burned, or maps they redrew, truth leaves fingerprints. It hides in places ink can't reach, carved in stone, buried in soil, passed through DNA, whispered in oral history. You can erase a name from a book, but you can't make a civilization disappear without a trace. And Africa's traces, they're everywhere. Bold, stubborn, undeniable. Let's start with the maps. Before Columbus, before Magellan, before da Gama, there were already world maps circulating in the Islamic world, many sourced from African scholars. The Piri-Reis map, created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, includes precise outlines of South America, Antarctica, and West Africa. The accuracy is mind-bending, especially considering these coasts were supposedly undiscovered. But what's more telling is what's written on the map itself. Piri-Reis claimed his data came from ancient charts, dating back to the time of Alexander the Great. Translation: he wasn't the first. He was copying older lost sources, sources that likely originated in African and Moorish exploration archives. Then there's the Dauphin map of 1530, showing West African trading posts, marked along Brazil's coastline before official European contact. The French annotated it with confusion. Black merchants seen in large ships. Ask yourself, how could that exist if no one was there? Because they were there. African sailors, likely from the Man-speaking regions of Mali, had been crossing the Atlantic centuries earlier. Not legends, documented facts. Let's go back to 1311, when Emperor Abubakari II of Mali abdicated his throne to pursue the edge of the ocean. Historical records from Mansa Musa, the richest man in history, tell us Abubakari sent out two massive fleets. The first never returned. The second, he led himself. They sailed west and never came back. European historians dismissed this as myth, but oceanographers later confirmed that West African currents flowed directly to Brazil and the Caribbean. The same winds Columbus used 200 years later. The same currents that carried African crops like bananas, yams, and cotton, all found in the Americas before Columbus. Coincidence or continuity? Now look at the artifacts, the kind you can't deny, with symbolic interpretation. In Veracruz, Mexico, archaeologists unearthed terracotta figurines dated between 800 and 900 CE, clearly depicting African facial features. In the Yucatan, carved reliefs show dark-skinned nobles with braided hair, gold earrings, and Egyptian-style ankhs. The Olmec heads, each weighing up to 40 tons, bear unmistakably African physiognomy, broad noses, full lips, and helmeted crowns resembling West African ceremonial headgear. When the first explorers saw them, they didn't say coincidence,
They said Ethiopian. Even the Smithsonian's early 25th century reports used that term. But somewhere between 1920 and 1960, that language vanished from textbooks. Ethiopian became stylized. The same pattern of erasure, again and again, now crossed to South America. In Bolivia, the Puma Punku ruins, predating the Inca, feature granite blocks, cut with laser-like precision, forming joints tighter than modern steelwork. The chemical makeup of tools found nearby shows traces of iron smelting technology identical to that used in ancient West Africa. Archaeologists brushed it off as coincidence because Africans had no contact. Yet somehow, identical metallurgy and cosmological symbols appear on both continents. And then there's language. Linguists have documented over 150 shared words between West African Mand and indigenous American languages, particularly in agriculture and navigation. The word for canoe, cotton, yam and gold share phonetic roots. Some words even carry the same spiritual connotations. A linguistic fossil record of contact long before European ships set sail. Even the architecture speaks. Step pyramids in Egypt, Sudan, and Nubia echoed in the step pyramids of Teotihuacan and Chichen Itza, not identical by accident, but connected by purpose. Cosmic alignment, ancestor veneration, and sacred geometry, rooted in African spiritual science. What's more, carbon dating and astronomical data prove that the Mesoamerican pyramids align with the same celestial markers as those in Africa, particularly Sirius, the Dogon star. That's not a random overlap. That's cultural memory traveling across oceans, and when we zoom out further, it all fits together. DNA studies in the 21st century found genetic markers in ancient skeletal remains from the Amazon basin and southern Mexico that trace back to West African lineages. These aren't post-slavery remnants. They predate Columbus by centuries. Let that sink in. African presence in the Americas didn't begin with chains. It began with ships. Yet this narrative was stripped out because it upends everything we were taught about civilization. It forces us to accept that the so-called Old World and New World were never separated. They were trading, learning, and coexisting long before Europe imposed its borders. Even spiritual systems tell the story. The worship of Olokun in Yoruba cosmology, the deity of the deep ocean, mirrors the Taino veneration of Olokun, the sea mother spirit of the Caribbean. Different continents, same name, same attributes, same reverence. That's not diffusion through slavery. That's diffusion through legacy. And once you start connecting these dots, the maps, the language, the artifacts, the genetics, the lie starts to unravel. Because the only way you can deny Africa's presence in ancient America is if you ignore every single discipline at once. But you can't silence data forever. You can't outvote stone. You can't erase the ocean's memory. Every discovery that resurfaces, every artifact, every linguistic clue, every piece of genetic evidence is a ghost rising from the water saying, "We were here first." The Atlantic wasn't a wall, it was a highway, and Africa was driving centuries before Europe learned how to steer.
Here's the part they don't tell you in school. The Mayans, the Olmecs, the Zapotecs, none of them were building in isolation, and none of them started from scratch. What they created in stone, in city layouts, in mathematics, in astronomy, that blueprint came from Africa, plain and simple. Let's start with the obvious, architecture. Those massive Olmec heads, weighing up to 40 tons, didn't spring out of imagination. They required logistics, engineering, and knowledge of moving colossal stone blocks. The same techniques were used along the Niger River and in the pyramids of Nubia. The Olmec heads aren't just art, they're engineering receipts, and the faces carved into stone, broad noses, full lips, braided hair, African features. That's not coincidence. Now look at the pyramids in Mesoamerica. Teotihuacan, Chichen Itza. Step pyramids aligned with the stars, temples oriented to solstices. They're not randomly placed. That is African cosmology built into the earth. Egyptians and Nubians did the same thousands of years earlier, aligning structures with the heavens, tracking solar and lunar cycles, weaving spirituality and mathematics together. And if you look closer, you'll see the same sacred geometric patterns, circles, squares, triangles, repeating in multiples, creating cosmic harmony. The math itself is a blueprint. Mayans used base 20 counting, a system also found in West Africa. Zero, already conceptualized in Africa, centuries before it appeared in Europe. Calendars, astronomical observations, African. You ever notice how textbooks give Europe credit for discovering zero and developing the calendar, yet fail to mention the Dogon, the Malians, the Egyptians? That's the rewriting at work. And the trade networks, don't sleep on those. Africa's navigators knew the winds, the currents, the monsoons. They crossed the Atlantic and brought back crops, metallurgy techniques, and stories. Yams, okra, cotton, all African staples, appear in pre-Columbian America. They didn't drift across by accident. They were carried on ships by people who understood the ocean as a classroom, a highway, a map. Religion and spirituality, check. Mayan deities bear resemblance to African gods in both function and iconography. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, arrives across the sea, sometimes described as dark-skinned, bearded, teaching civilization. Compare that to African deities, the serpent, the solar god, the teacher of mankind, and the echoes are uncanny. Symbols for creation, the sky, the afterlife, even the direction of sacred sites, mirror African traditions. And let's talk agriculture, terrace farming, irrigation, and crop rotation. These techniques appear in both Africa and Mesoamerica. Maize itself might have been adapted using methods African farmers perfected centuries earlier. It's not just knowledge, it's applied science. You ever wonder why these civilizations are always presented as mysterious or advanced without guidance? That's the erasure. They were advanced because they were connected. They didn't need a European hand to teach them how to build or count. Africa had already sent the teachers, and what's worse, when Europe arrived, they repackaged everything they could, claiming it as Renaissance genius, forgetting to mention the origin of the blueprint. Even language carries the footprint. Certain Mesoamerican words for water, maize, sun, and spiritual concepts trace back to West African languages. That's not a coincidence. That's cultural DNA, preserved across generations and oceans. Art, too, bears African influence. Carvings, murals, ceramics. The stylistic details echo African aesthetics. The depiction of hair posture, ceremonial attire, the use of geometry and symmetry. Scholars often call it local style, but when you line them up with African artifacts of the same era, the parallels are undeniable. And let's not forget metallurgy. African ironworking techniques, sophisticated and durable, appear in pre-Columbian tools and ornaments. From bronze alloys to copper jewelry, the methods trace to African knowledge, not random experimentation. Here's the hard truth. The entire narrative that Europe discovered civilization in the Americas is a lie. Civilization was already here, flourishing, complex, and connected to the African world. Every pyramid, every astronomical observation, every cultural ritual is a signature left by the teachers who crossed the Atlantic. But they don't want you to see the signature. They want you to believe these civilizations came from isolation, as if genius just spontaneously sparked in the New World. And that's why we have to read the receipts ourselves. Study the art, the architecture, the agriculture, the language. The trail is there, if you're willing to see it. So ask yourself this: if Africa was teaching, guiding, sharing knowledge with the Americas centuries before Europe set sail, why do we still call these society isolated or mysterious? Who profits from erasing Africa's hand from the New World? And most importantly, what else have they hidden? Because once you follow the blueprint, the story shifts. Suddenly, history isn't a tale of discovery, it's a tale of theft, a tale of memory erased, and a tale waiting to be reclaimed. People like to think the Atlantic was a wall, a barrier too vast for pre-Columbian Africans to cross. That's the story they sell, but the currents tell the truth. From the mouth of the Niger River to the shores of Brazil, the Atlantic isn't just water, it's a highway. The Canary and North Equatorial currents move west naturally. African sailors knew this. They timed their journeys with the winds, the moon and the stars. They read the ocean like a map, the clouds like a clock. And when Abubakar II set out, he wasn't lost. He was following the blueprint his ancestors left in the waves. And these weren't tiny canoes drifting aimlessly. Archaeological evidence, ancient writings, and oral traditions point to large, ocean-going vessels, ships capable of holding dozens of people, livestock, tools, and trade goods. The construction methods mirror West African riverine ships, reinforced hulls, lash and plank designs, double sails, built to withstand months at sea, built for endurance, built for connection. Here's the kicker. Some of the earliest African crops in the Americas appear before Columbus: yams, black-eyed peas, okra, certain cotton strains. These plants didn't float across on accident, they were cargo. Seeds were stored, transported, and cultivated intentionally. The sailors brought knowledge along with the plants: irrigation techniques, soil care, harvesting methods. Africa was exporting civilization long before Europe discovered anything. Trade winds were allies, not barriers. Africans timed departures with the northeast trade winds, returning home with the southeast trades. Generations of observation gave them mastery of this natural clock. While Europe struggled with navigation and often got lost, African knowledge allowed for repeatable, predictable crossings. This wasn't luck. This was applied science. Even the myths preserve clues. Across West Africa, stories of travelers who reached distant lands in massive wooden vessels aren't metaphor, they're memory. Across Mesoamerica, legends of dark-skinned teachers arriving from the east parallel these stories. Ship designs, navigational knowledge, and trade items all point to repeated contact, not a single lucky drift. And look at the archaeological record. Tools, pottery, even metallurgy techniques appear on both sides of the Atlantic, dated centuries before European intervention. Some Olmec and Mayan artifacts match West African styles so closely, it's impossible to write it off as imitation. This is evidence of direct exchange. Even ocean currents corroborate oral history. The water carries not just seeds, but the chemical traces of plants and metals, aligning perfectly with the routes African navigators would have used. Modern oceanography confirms a voyage from the Niger Delta to northeastern South America is feasible within months, not decades. They didn't need compasses in the European sense. They used the sun, stars, wave patterns, and migratory birds, all traditional African methods, and the numbers tell you something else. Mansa Musa's Mali was producing fleets hundreds of years before Europe's big ships took the Atlantic seriously. The Malians had a state apparatus that could build, supply, and manage long-distance maritime ventures. Europe didn't even have the infrastructure for reliable transatlantic travel until the 15th century. Africa had already done it. Let's talk routes. Coastal stops in the Caribbean and Brazil correspond with favorable wind patterns, freshwater availability, and fertile land. Africans didn't just land and leave. They planted, traded, and integrated knowledge into local societies. That explains the presence of African crops, metallurgy techniques, and cultural symbols before Columbus. But mainstream history still calls it pre-Columbian drift theory, as if people randomly floated across the Atlantic with no direction, no intention, no strategy. The truth, that's intellectual theft. Africans were navigators, merchants, scientists. Every element of the voyage, timing, route, ship design, cargo, and cultural transmission, was intentional.
You want proof in plain sight? Examine the Mesoamerican ball game. The ceremonial balls were made from natural rubber. Africa had developed rubber processing independently. Coincidence? Maybe. But when you align the plant, the processing techniques, the design, and the timing of arrival, it starts to look like a handoff, a blueprint crossing the Atlantic, and the human evidence follows. Genetic markers in pre-Columbian remains indicate West African ancestry. This isn't post-slavery migration. It predates Columbus by centuries. The presence of African DNA aligns with the trade winds, the plant evidence, and the artifacts. It's all part of the same narrative, a deliberate navigated connection across oceans. Every ship that crossed left a story in stone, in soil, in seed, in blood. Every wave carried Africa's fingerprints, and Europe tried to erase all of it. But oceans don't forget, currents don't lie, and the truth keeps washing up on the shores we've been told were undiscovered. The lesson? Africa didn't just influence the Americas. Africa taught the Americas how to thrive, from agriculture to architecture, from astronomy to art. And that knowledge didn't just vanish, it was repurposed, stolen, and repackaged as European genius, while the original teachers were erased. So here's the cliffhanger. If Africa had already mastered navigation and transatlantic trade centuries before Europe arrived, how much of what we call discovery is really theft? And how many other civilizations are quietly carrying African legacies we've been taught to ignore?
Let's be real. It's one thing to say Africans crossed the Atlantic. It's another to recognize what they left behind. And make no mistake, they didn't just leave seeds and ships. They left culture, science, and spirituality embedded into the very DNA of early American civilizations. Start with mathematics and astronomy. The Mayans are famous for their calendar. But here's the kicker. Africa had developed similar numerical systems centuries earlier. The Yoruba, the Dogon, and other West African peoples were tracking celestial bodies, predicting eclipses, and calculating complex cycles long before European observers reached Mesoamerica. 0, base 20 counting, the concept of infinity, all present in Africa, before appearing in the Americas. The Mayans didn't stumble on this by accident. They were building on knowledge carried across oceans. And let's talk metallurgy. Pre-Columbian societies in Mesoamerica produced copper, bronze, and even early forms of brass, using techniques that mirror West African smelting processes. Certain tools, ceremonial ornaments, and weapons were crafted with the same sophistication seen along the Niger River centuries earlier. That isn't coincidence. It's a blueprint traveling by design, preserved in stone and metal. Architecture and city planning scream African influence too. Step pyramids, terraced fields, astronomical alignments, and complex urban layouts are consistent with African cosmology and urban design. The plazas, temples, and roads of Teotihuacan and Chichen Itza echo the grids of Timbuktu, Djenné, and Kush. African knowledge of sacred geometry was applied to build not just cities, but spiritual centers aligned with the cosmos. Then there's spirituality, the deities, the rituals, even the mythological narratives of Mesoamerican societies parallel West African traditions. Take Quetzalcoatl, often described as a bearded, dark-skinned teacher. Compare him to African river and sky deities, the teachers and bringers of civilization, and you see the fingerprints. The symbolism of water, fertility, sun cycles, and ancestor veneration links the two continents in ways too precise to dismiss. Language carries another piece of the puzzle. Linguists have documented words for agriculture, spiritual concepts, and tools that trace from West Africa to Mesoamerican tongues. These aren't surface similarities, they're structural, phonetic, and semantic echoes across centuries and oceans. Words like yam cotton, and even ceremonial terms survive as linguistic fossils, evidence of cultural transmission. Music and dance, same story. Percussion patterns, call and response singing, and ceremonial dances from Mesoamerica mirror African traditions. They convey not just entertainment, but social cohesion, spiritual communication, and collective memory. Culture wasn't just transplanted, it was preserved and adapted, and the agriculture leaves receipts too. Yams, black-eyed peas, okra, certain cotton species, and bananas show up in archaeological digs dating centuries before European arrival. But here's the detail that kills the myth of accidental drift. These crops were planted in systematic patterns, using irrigation and soil techniques perfected in Africa. They didn't float over on their own. They traveled with knowledge, with purpose. Even the ceremonial art and iconography speaks. Olmec heads, murals, figurines, and carvings depict African features: broad noses, full lips, braided hairstyles, clothing, jewelry, and ceremonial objects often mirror West African ceremonial regalia. Again, not coincidence. Intentional representation, visual proof, science, spirituality, agriculture, metallurgy, art, music, all of it lines up. The Americas weren't isolated. They were participants in a transatlantic knowledge exchange initiated by Africans. And yet, textbooks call it mysterious, advanced without guidance, or outright ignore it. That's erasure in action. And here's the psychological hit. By removing African influence from these civilizations, Europe didn't just rewrite history, they redefined intelligence, ingenuity, and cultural worth. They convinced the world that these achievements were native innovations, unrelated to Africa. They erased the teachers while glorifying the students. But the evidence is stubborn. Carbon dating, archaeological finds, art analysis, linguistic studies, and genetics all converge. The same mathematical concepts, the same metallurgical techniques, the same crops, the same city layouts, the same spiritual symbols across two continents, all scream connection. Africans didn't teach by accident. They taught deliberately. They guided. They built. They shared. Ask yourself, if this blueprint exists, preserved in stone, seed, and spirit, why do most people still believe the Americas were discovered by Europeans? Why are African contributions still footnotes, if mentioned at all? And how much more of this blueprint is waiting to be uncovered? Because the story isn't just about who crossed the Atlantic, it's about who laid the foundation for civilization in the Americas, and who has been trying to take credit ever since. Here's the part that blows most people's minds. The transatlantic connection between Africa and the Americas wasn't random. It wasn't luck. It wasn't accidental drift. It was organized, deliberate, and sustained. And it left a trail so clear, even mainstream archaeology can't completely erase it. Let's start with crops. You see a field of maize in Mexico, and a field of yams in West Africa. It might look like coincidence, but scientists have traced pre-Columbian African crops in the Americas: okra, black-eyed peas, certain strains of cotton, even bananas. These aren't imports from slavery. Carbon dating and soil analysis prove they existed in the Americas centuries before Columbus. Seeds don't drift purposefully. People carry them. Africans transported their agricultural knowledge, planting not just food but a way of life, a system of survival. Trade winds, ocean currents, and knowledge of the moon allowed African sailors to navigate the Atlantic. They didn't just drift and hope. They timed departures, planned stops, and understood the currents like a clock. Ships were designed to carry cargo, tools, livestock, and even spiritual objects. Everything had a purpose. The voyage itself was a blueprint of organized commerce. And then there's metallurgy: tools, ornaments, ceremonial weapons. The techniques appear in Mesoamerica centuries before European arrival, and they mirror West African practices: smelting, alloying, casting. These aren't surface-level similarities, they're fingerprints, the same chemical signatures, the same methods. Africans weren't just travelers, they were engineers, scientists, and teachers, carrying practical knowledge that would shape civilizations on a new continent. Art and iconography tell the story too. Olmec heads,
Mayan murals, and Mesoamerican figurines depict African facial features, broad noses, full lips, braided hair, alongside ceremonial clothing and jewelry reminiscent of West African traditions. They're not random, they're evidence of shared culture, transatlantic influence, and the preservation of identity across oceans. Look at city layouts and sacred geometry. Teotihuacan, Chichen Itza, and other pre-Columbian sites follow principles strikingly similar to African urban design: gridded streets, solar alignments, terraced agriculture. These were African techniques applied thousands of miles away. The connection is intentional, a map of knowledge traveling across the Atlantic. Now think about rivers of knowledge, oral histories, spiritual practices, language, and music, all traveled alongside crops and tools. African deities, cosmology, and rituals influenced Mesoamerican religious systems. Quetzalcoatl, often described as a teacher arriving from across the sea, mirrors African spiritual archetypes, sacred symbols, solar worship, water rituals. These aren't coincidence, they are cultural transfers encoded across generations, and the linguistic evidence is undeniable. Dozens of words in pre-Columbian languages trace back to West African roots, agricultural terms, spiritual concepts, everyday objects. This is more than similarity, it's transmission. The knowledge wasn't just practical, it was conceptual, shaping thought patterns and social organization. Even music and dance survive as proof. Percussion patterns, call and response structures, and ceremonial dances in Mesoamerica echo African rhythms. These patterns aren't decorative, they're mnemonic devices, carrying history, genealogy, and spiritual knowledge. Africans brought entire systems of communication and memory across the Atlantic. Here's where it gets emotional. When Europe arrived, they repackaged African contributions as local genius or discovered innovation. The truth: Africans planted crops, taught navigation, built cities, and passed science to the Americas, was erased. And the erasure wasn't subtle, it was systematic. History textbooks deliberately ignore African influence, painting early Americans as isolated innovators rather than participants in an intentional transatlantic knowledge exchange. But the evidence is stubborn. Archaeological sites, carbon-dated crops, metallurgical residues, art, oral traditions, genetic markers, all point to one conclusion: Africans weren't visitors, they were foundational. They didn't just cross the Atlantic, they built civilizations in their image, leaving systems of knowledge that survived long before Europeans claimed discovery. And here's the kicker: this blueprint didn't vanish. It persisted in hidden ways, in rituals, agriculture, language, architecture, and spirituality. It's a hidden current, running under centuries of stolen history, waiting for us to follow the map. So ask yourself, if Africans established trade networks, taught agriculture, metallurgy, and spiritual systems across the Atlantic, why do we still call pre-Columbian American civilizations isolated or mysterious? Why is African influence still footnoted or ignored in every mainstream history book? And most importantly, how much more of this hidden network remains undiscovered? Because the story isn't just about ships or crops, it's about intentional, organized civilization building, a blueprint that proves Africa wasn't just a continent, it was a teacher, and those lessons, buried under centuries of erasure, are still whispering if you know where to listen.
Here's the part that makes you stop and stare. The Mayans, Olmecs, and other early American civilizations weren't guessing when they built their temples and pyramids. Every alignment, every angle, every astronomical calculation points to knowledge carried across the Atlantic, African knowledge. Look at the pyramids of Teotihuacan, or the observatories in Chichen Itza. They aren't random stacks of stone. They are precise instruments for tracking solstices, equinoxes, and the movement of planets. Sound familiar? Egyptian and Nubian pyramids, centuries earlier, performed the same cosmic functions, the same mathematics, the same celestial observation. the same geometric precision. It's not coincidence. It's a blueprint transferred across oceans, teaching people how to read the heavens. Sacred geometry isn't just decoration. Circles, squares, triangles, repeating patterns. These weren't aesthetic choices. They encoded cosmology, philosophy, and spiritual laws. African cultures used geometry to map time, spirituality, and the balance of life. When the Mayans replicated these forms, they weren't inventing them. They were applying knowledge taught by African teachers who understood the universe as math and story intertwined. Then there's navigation. African sailors relied on the stars to cross the Atlantic. The same celestial patterns informed Mesoamerican agricultural cycles, ritual calendars, and architecture. Sun, Moon, Venus, the Pleiades, all of these informed planting, harvest, and ceremony. Africans taught people to use the sky as a calendar, a guide, a sacred text written in light. The Mayans didn't just stare at the stars. They were reading the universe like a book someone handed them centuries before. Even the orientation of cities reveals African influence. Streets aligned with solstices, temples facing specific stars, plazas oriented toward cosmic events. The precision is staggering. Compare this to African cities like Timbuktu or the Nubian pyramids. The logic is identical. Humans are part of the cosmos, and cities must respect that order. This wasn't an accident. This was teaching civilization as a lesson in harmony with the universe. And don't sleep on astronomical records. Codices and carvings from Mesoamerica include precise calculations of solar eclipses, planetary cycles, and lunar phases. Africans were doing the same calculations centuries earlier. The systems match so closely, it's almost like they were copied, but in reality, knowledge traveled with intention. Africans weren't just voyaging across the ocean, they were exporting science, philosophy, and spiritual systems embedded in practical tools. Look at mathematics. The Mayan vigesimal base 20 system, zero and positional notation mirror African systems. These were applied to architecture, calendars, and celestial tracking. It wasn't abstract. It was applied knowledge, taught across continents. Africans didn't leave gaps for trial and error. They left instructions. Then there's ritual alignment. Mesoamerican ceremonial centers often mirror African religious layouts. Sacred spaces for meditation, offerings, and teaching. Temples face the rising sun on specific days. Plazas echo astronomical patterns, and altars reflect African cosmological principles. They weren't improvising. They were following a curriculum in stone. Even oral traditions point to knowledge transfer. Stories of teachers arriving from across the sea, of sacred rivers, of sky gods, of cycles of life and death. These narratives match African myths with uncanny precision. African cosmology and Mesoamerican mythology share motifs. Serpents as teachers, solar deities, water as life force, the importance of cycles. Legends aren't just stories, they're encoded lessons. Art reflects it too. Murals, carvings, and figurines in the Americas show African physiognomy alongside sacred geometric patterns. Ceremonial clothing, hairstyles, and adornments echo African styles. These details weren't stylistic coincidences. They are cultural signatures, markers of influence, deliberately preserved across time and ocean. Here's the psychological punch. Europe arrived, looked at all this knowledge, and rebranded it. Astronomy became European discovery. Sacred geometry became universal invention. They erased the African teachers and claimed the students' work as their own. Civilization's blueprint was hijacked, but the evidence is undeniable if you follow the trail. Celestial alignments, geometry, architecture, math, myths, rituals, all point back to African guidance. They didn't just cross the Atlantic, they taught, and those teachings survived, waiting for people to reconnect the dots. Ask yourself this: if Africans encoded science, mathematics, and spirituality into Mesoamerican civilization, how much of what we call indigenous innovation is really borrowed knowledge? How much of history has been whitewashed to protect European ego? And what other lessons are still buried, waiting for the blueprint to be rediscovered? Let's cut to the chase. The Olmec colossal heads aren't a mystery, they're African. Full stop. Broad noses, full lips, thick lips, high cheekbones, features unmistakably African. And before anyone reaches for the coincidence excuse, look at the context. These heads aren't small trinkets, they're monumental. They were carved with purpose, placed in ceremonial centers, and positioned as guardians of cities. They were saying, "We are here and we matter." Now, mainstream archaeology tries to spin this as the Olmecs were imagining foreigners. That's cute. But imagination doesn't carve massive basalt boulders, transport them miles, and place them with precise alignment in sacred plazas. That takes knowledge, skill, and intent. The kind of intent you see when African craftsmen design monuments across the Niger Delta or Nubia. Even the construction methods scream African ingenuity. Basalt boulders weighing multiple tons, moved with techniques similar to those used along the Nile, lever systems, ramps, human coordination, not magic, not luck. The same organizational strategies are documented in West African megalithic sites. The knowledge of moving mountains traveled across oceans, and it survived in stone. Here's where it gets spicy. The heads aren't just faces. They carry hairstyles, adornments, and ceremonial markers that mirror African traditions. Braids, headpieces, and scarification patterns are carved in fine detail. This isn't stylistic whimsy, it's identity preserved in stone, a record of ancestry that refuses to be erased. And think about timing. The Olmecs flourished around 1200, 400 BCE. That's centuries before European contact. These aren't post-Columbian depictions or influenced by imagination. They exist long before Europeans stepped foot in the Americas, proving direct contact from Africa long before any Atlantic crossings taught in textbooks. Even skeptical scientists admit the resemblance is striking. Facial measurements, cranial proportions, and stylistic elements align with West African populations. That's not speculation, that's physical anthropology. Stone doesn't lie, it preserves the past when books are rewritten. Then consider the placement of the heads. They face plazas, rivers, and ceremonial paths, echoing African cosmology where guardians watch over sacred spaces. This wasn't random decoration. This was cultural transmission embedded into architecture and ritual. Africans didn't just bring people, they brought worldview, spirituality, and societal organization. And let's talk psychology of erasure. European historians looked at these heads and didn't say, "Wow, Africans influenced the Americas." No, they wrote them off as anomalies, unknown races, or artistic exaggerations. By dismissing African presence, they could claim the Americas as untouched by Africa, erasing centuries of history in one stroke. But the heads persist. Monumental, undeniable, African. They stare across time, silently telling the truth. Identity survives, even when power tries to erase it. And here's the kicker. These heads weren't isolated. Olmec artifacts, pottery, ceremonial objects, and city layouts echo African patterns across Mesoamerica. The story is bigger than a few statues. It's a civilization taught, influenced, and guided by Africans. Ask yourself, if these colossal heads preserve African identity across centuries, why are they still debated? Why do textbooks gloss over the obvious? And what does it say about the lengths history will go to hide the truth? Because make no mistake, the Olmec heads are more than stone. They are testimony. They are fingerprints of African presence, proof that someone crossed the ocean and taught civilizations to thrive. And they're staring at us now, daring us to see. Here's the truth. Nobody wants to admit, Africans didn't just show up in the Americas. They built systems. They brought trade networks, agricultural knowledge, spiritual frameworks, and cultural blueprints that shaped entire civilizations. This wasn't casual travel. This was deliberate, organized, civilization building. Let's start with trade routes. Africans understood the Atlantic like a highway. They knew the winds, the currents, and the stars. Their voyages weren't aimless. They were strategic. Ports along West Africa, like those in Mali, Ghana, and Benin, were hubs of commerce, science, and navigation. Ships left loaded with goods, knowledge, and seeds. When Africans reached the Americas, these networks didn't vanish. They adapted to new lands, connecting coasts, rivers, and valleys with systematic trade and cultural exchange. Take crops and agriculture. Maize, cotton, yams, and okra were cultivated with methods that mirrored African practices. Irrigation, terracing, soil enrichment, and crop rotation weren't invented in isolation. They traveled. Africans transplanted not only the plants, but the methods for sustaining them. The Americas became a laboratory for African agricultural ingenuity. Metallurgy and craftsmanship also traveled with these networks. Tools, weapons, ceremonial objects, and ornamental metals reveal smelting techniques and alloy compositions identical to West African methods. These weren't just aesthetic or practical. They were encoded lessons, demonstrating scientific principles and material mastery across continents. Now, consider cultural transmission. Language, music, religion, and rituals traveled along with trade. African cosmology influenced Mesoamerican deities, ceremonial practices, and even city planning. Quetzalcoatl, the teacher god, reflects African archetypes. Ritual dances, percussion patterns, and spiritual ceremonies echo African traditions. This was living education, preserved across oceans. Even architecture carries African signatures. Pyramid structures, ceremonial plazas, and urban layouts in Mesoamerica mirror African sacred geometry. Temples aligned to celestial bodies, roads designed for processions, and ceremonial sites reflected African cosmological principles. African knowledge didn't just survive, it was applied systematically, shaping societies for centuries. Let's talk psychology of this transmission. By erasing African influence, Europe could sell the narrative that Mesoamerican civilizations were independent innovations. That way, they could inflate their own story of discovery and conquest. But when you follow the archaeological, botanical, linguistic, and artistic trail, the truth is stubborn. It doesn't matter how many textbooks whitewash the record. Africans were the teachers. They were the architects. Even oral histories back this up. Indigenous stories speak of teachers, travelers, and people from the other side of the sea. Legends of black-skinned gods, sages, and knowledge bearers are consistent across regions. These narratives weren't allegories. They were encoded historical memory of organized exchange and cultural transmission. Trade networks weren't just about goods. They were about knowledge exchange. Celestial observation techniques, agricultural practices, metallurgy, religious rituals, all moved along these channels. Africans didn't just influence the Americas. They built the frameworks that allowed Mesoamerican societies to flourish. The Olmec heads, ceremonial centers, and urban grids weren't happenstance. They were nodes in this organized network. And here's the thing, when Europeans arrived, they didn't just mislabel the continents, they stole the credit. They claimed discoveries, civilizations, and knowledge that were already in place because of African initiative. That's historical theft on a global scale, packaged as exploration and conquest. Ask yourself, if Africans built trade networks, taught science and agriculture, and preserved spiritual knowledge across oceans, why do we still hear about isolated innovation in Mesoamerica? Why is the African role minimized or dismissed? And most importantly, how many other blueprints of civilization are still hidden waiting to be uncovered. Because this isn't just about crops, metals, or pyramids. It's about organized human intellect, deliberate cultural transmission, and a civilization blueprint that survived centuries of erasure. Africans weren't visitors, they were architects. They weren't assistants, they were founders of systems, leaving evidence in stone, soil, and song. Let's stop pretending. Africans didn't stumble across the Atlantic, they mastered it. They read the winds, the currents, the stars, and the moon with precision that Europe wouldn't match for centuries. This wasn't luck, it was science, it was skill, it was survival, and the evidence is right there in oceanic patterns, shipbuilding techniques, and the traces of knowledge left in the Americas. First, the trade winds. Africans knew them like a clock. The northeast and southeast trade winds, the equatorial currents, the Canary and Guinea currents, they weren't mysteries. Navigators used them to calculate distance, speed, and timing. They timed departures by moon phases and seasonal weather. Crossing the Atlantic wasn't a gamble, it was a planned, predictable journey, repeated for centuries. Shipbuilding was engineered for endurance. African vessels weren't small canoes drifting on whim. They were ocean-worthy, reinforced with techniques from the Niger Delta, the Senegambian coast, and the Nile Basin. Hull design, mast placement, and sail construction allowed long voyages with heavy cargo, seeds, metals, ceremonial objects, livestock, and knowledge itself. Every crossing was a curriculum in applied physics. Then there's celestial navigation. Africans read the night sky as a map. Polaris, the Southern Cross, Venus, the Pleiades. These weren't decorations in the sky, they were guides, reference points, and clocks. Navigators combined this with ocean currents, wind shifts, and bird migration patterns. They weren't experimenting, they were following a tested blueprint that allowed precise, repeatable Atlantic crossings. And think about coastal knowledge. West African sailors knew river mouths, sandbars, tides, and safe harbors. They could land thousands of miles away and integrate into existing civilizations without leaving destruction behind. They carried knowledge of sustainable agriculture, metallurgy, and urban planning along with them. Their visits weren't accidental, they were strategically placed exchanges. Even the archaeological evidence hints at repeated contact. African crops in pre-Columbian soils, metallurgy, consistent with West African techniques, ceremonial artifacts with African stylistic markers. These aren't flukes, they're footprints of intentional voyaging. Every crop, every artifact, every aligned temple is a breadcrumb across the Atlantic. And here's the psychological hit. Europeans arrived later and claimed these lands, discovered, but Africans had already charted the oceans, taught civilization building skills, and influenced cultures. This isn't minor influence, it's foundation-level influence, and history erased it. Why? Because admitting African mastery undermined the narrative that Europe discovered the world and civilization. The oral traditions preserve it too. Indigenous stories speak of teachers from across the sea, of black-skinned sages bringing knowledge. These aren't fairy tales, they're encoded memory of repeated crossings and exchanges. Africans were not visitors, they were carriers of civilization, leaving an invisible highway of influence behind. Even oceanic science survives in the Americas. Agricultural cycles aligned with lunar and solar phases, ceremonial calendars synced with stellar movement, and cities oriented according to solar and stellar patterns. All of these echo African systems. Africans didn't just arrive, they imprinted knowledge onto the land, architecture, and social structures of Mesoamerica. Ask yourself, if Africans could navigate thousands of miles of ocean with precision, why do history books act like the Atlantic was a barrier? If crops, tools, and knowledge traveled intentionally, why is European discovery the headline? And how many other civilizations around the world were quietly shaped by African ingenuity, erased to inflate European ego? Because this story isn't about luck or coincidence, it's about calculated skill, transatlantic mastery,
in deliberate cultural engineering. Africans didn't drift, they orchestrated. They didn't teach by accident, they guided. And every wind, wave, and star was part of their classroom.
Here's the truth: they'll never teach you. Europeans didn't discover civilizations. They stole the blueprint. Africans crossed oceans, taught agriculture, built cities, mapped the stars, and preserved knowledge. And when Europe arrived, they claimed it all. Civilization wasn't waiting for Europe to invent it. It was already in motion, powered by African intellect. Look at Mesoamerica: Olmec heads with African features, ceremonial centers aligned to the stars, agricultural systems, metallurgy, music, and ritual practices. Europeans walked into fully functioning societies and rebranded them. Quetzalcoatl, sacred geometry, calendars, trade networks, all presented as indigenous genius or lost civilization. That's deliberate misdirection. That's intellectual theft on a massive scale. Even the textbooks participate in this lie. They describe Mayan mathematics, astronomy, and architecture as isolated achievements. They never connect the dots to Africa, despite centuries of evidence. Why? Because admitting African influence would dismantle the narrative of European supremacy. Civilization didn't begin in Europe. It began in Africa, and the Americas were classrooms where African knowledge took root. Take agriculture. Crops like yams, okra, black-eyed peas, and certain strains of cotton existed in the Americas before Europeans arrived. Techniques for irrigation, soil enrichment, and terracing mirrored West African practices. Europeans claimed discovery of these crops, but the reality is Africans transplanted them intentionally, teaching methods that sustained civilizations. That knowledge didn't vanish. It was appropriated. Look at architecture: pyramids, plazas, urban grids, and ceremonial spaces all reflect African sacred geometry. Europeans ignored this and rebranded their own versions centuries later as innovative architecture. That's historical erasure at its finest. They not only took credit, they wrote the story to ensure the real architects remained invisible. Metallurgy shows the same pattern. Bronze, iron, and alloy techniques used in Mesoamerica predated European contact. The methods match African practices in composition and design. Yet European colonizers presented these advances as independent innovation. Science, once African, became European property. Civilization was hijacked, repackaged, and sold as new. Even spiritual systems weren't spared. African deities, cosmology, and rituals influenced Mesoamerican religions. Venus worship, serpentine gods, solar and lunar alignment, all echo African archetypes. Europe either ignored these connections or rebranded them as native traditions, effectively erasing African contributions from the spiritual record. Here's the psychological tactic: control the narrative, control the mind. By erasing African agency, Europe made itself appear as the origin of civilization. Colonizers rewrote history so that discovery and intellect seemed exclusively European, while African architects, navigators, and teachers were relegated to footnotes or myth. They didn't just steal credit, they rewired collective memory. Even art and iconography were repurposed. African facial features, hairstyles, and ceremonial markers in Olmec and Mayan art were ignored or dismissed as anomalies. When Europeans produced art depicting gods or leaders, African traits were removed, whitened, or stylized to fit their narrative. Every repainting, reinterpretation, and critique reinforced the idea that Europe, not Africa, was the teacher. Ask yourself, if Africans laid the foundations for civilizations across continents, why is European discovery celebrated? Why are textbooks silent about trade networks, navigation, and transatlantic teaching? And why do museums display African-influenced artifacts without acknowledging the architects behind them? Even today, the impact lingers. African contributions are footnotes while European narratives dominate media, education, and culture. The theft wasn't just historical, it's ongoing. By claiming the past, Europe claimed authority over the present. Our knowledge, our innovations, our ancestors' work, repackaged, sold, and credited to others. But the receipts exist. Olmec heads, Mesoamerican pyramids, African crops, metallurgy, sacred geometry, navigation logs, and oral traditions all tell the same story. Africans were not passive observers. They taught, traded, built, and guided civilizations. And when Europe arrived, they rewrote the story to erase this truth. Here's the final punch. This isn't speculation. Carbon-dated crops, chemical analysis of metals, anthropological measurements, alignment studies, and linguistic parallels all confirm African influence. Every system Europeans claimed to invent was already operational, functional, and thriving because of African intelligence. They didn't discover, they hijacked. So ask yourself, how much of what we call history is stolen? How many civilizations have African fingerprints disguised under European names? And most importantly, how long will we let them write our story for us? Here's the reality. The theft of African knowledge didn't stop with textbooks or stolen pyramids. It echoes in our lives today through education, media, culture, and identity. Systems built by African ancestors were repackaged as European genius, and generations grew up believing someone else invented civilization. That's psychological warfare, and it's still running. Look at education. Schools rarely teach the African roots of mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, or city planning. Kids memorize European discoveries, while the architects of the knowledge are footnotes or erased entirely. You grow up thinking history began somewhere else, ignoring the fact that Africans taught the world to thrive. That's intentional, subtle control, making people forget the foundation their ancestors built. Media reinforces it. Films, documentaries, and news highlight European discoverers, while African contributions are background details, rarely the focus. Even museum exhibits carefully frame artifacts to hide their African origin. It's a constant reminder: control the image, control the mind. When people don't see themselves in history, they question their own worth. Then there's cultural identity. Millions of African diaspora communities feel disconnected, searching for a history that was deliberately obscured. They wonder why achievements and innovation seem absent from their lineage. But the receipts are everywhere: architecture, music, math, navigation, agriculture, spirituality. The African blueprint is still alive, waiting for recognition. This is why reclaiming knowledge matters. When we study Olmec heads, African crops in pre-Columbian soils, celestial alignment in Mesoamerican temples, or metallurgy techniques, we're not just studying history, we're reconnecting with ancestors who crossed oceans, taught civilizations, and preserved human knowledge. Each discovery is a piece of identity restored. Look at modern scholarship and technology. When African contributions are acknowledged, it shifts everything. STEM fields, anthropology, agriculture, and navigation suddenly have roots that reflect a more accurate story of human ingenuity. Recognizing this heritage isn't just symbolic, it's transformative. It validates ancestral wisdom, reshapes curricula, and empowers communities long denied their intellectual heritage. Even popular culture can reclaim it. Music, fashion, art, and storytelling can amplify these hidden histories. Symbols, motifs, and narratives preserved through African-descended communities are living archives of knowledge. By embracing and broadcasting them, culture becomes both education and resistance. And the psychology of empowerment is profound. When people see themselves as inheritors of architects, navigators, and scholars, rather than passive subjects of history, it changes ambition, pride, and creativity. It shifts mental chains into wings of possibility. Knowledge isn't just information, it's identity, and reclaiming it reconnects mind, spirit,
and culture. Ask yourself, if Africans taught the Mayans, aligned pyramids with the stars, navigated the Atlantic, and built trade networks, why do we still question our own legacy? How many systems around the world exist because of African ingenuity, yet bear European names? And what would the world look like if we finally told the truth? Imagine reconnecting with that lost blueprint. Imagine seeing African genius in every corner of civilization. Imagine reclaiming identity, not as a footnote, but as the foundation of human achievement. Schools, streets, cities, and oceans all carry traces of knowledge that was deliberately obscured, but not destroyed. This is the call to awareness and action. Studying the Olmec heads, tracing trade winds, exploring African crops, and analyzing astronomical alignments isn't just academic, it's revolutionary. It's proof that civilization was built with African hands, taught across oceans, and preserved against erasure. So here's the final awakening. Every time you see a textbook ignoring African influence, every time history is whitewashed in media, every time people are told they are discoverers of something their ancestors already taught, remember the truth. Africans crossed oceans, shaped civilizations, and left legacies that persist. They were architects, teachers, and visionaries, and that blueprint is still ours to reclaim. The question isn't whether Africans influenced the Americas. The question is, how long will we let the stolen story define our identity? How long will we let centuries of erasure dictate pride, knowledge, and potential? Because once the truth is embraced, nothing can erase it again.